Okay, are we ready to get started, everybody?
Yes.
That's great.
Are you guys trying to finish your?
Keep going. I can multitask. I'm almost there. Sorry.
No, it's totally fine. Well, I'm excited to be here with all of you tonight. I'm looking forward to a really good conversation. And we'll talk a little bit more why it's just, important to have for the council to have this time in just a bit. But just a little bit about myself. I think I introduced myself to everyone who I didn't know. But my name's Kristen Gunther. In addition to being your facilitator, I also live in Lander, and not only do I live in Lander, I live about a block away. So thank you for officially being the closest work site that I've ever had to my place of residence. So this is very exciting. I've really been looking forward to this conversation, and I want to note upfront, obviously, quite a bit has happened since the initial kind of intake conversations that we had to begin this process. And so, among other things, conversations around the budget and how budgeting and kind of fiscal resources is going to impact strategic planning moving forward will be something that certainly kind of helps inform the conversation today. Oh, no.
You might
There we
have
go.
to, scroll.
Yeah, I think
the
I'm just gonna
pages.
arrows maybe. Okay, so we will start with some opening conversation and content and talk a little bit about the approach that we'll take tonight. And in some ways, 2 hours is a good chunk of time, but also it's barely going to let us scratch the surface for some of the strategic priorities that we'll discuss. So I'll tell you right up front that this is the beginning of a much longer series of conversations that I hope that you all have as a council. And certainly I will come back to a session to present a report to help continue that conversation. But what's exciting is this is the high level strategy component. This is our time to zoom out and think big at the 30,000 foot level about the city's mission, about the really big kind of buckets of priority areas for the next several years ahead in the future. We will not really get into the nitty gritty of tasks if we can help it. Sometimes that is important, but trying to keep us at that higher level and think about the why, less than the kind of who, what, when, where, how pieces that will be about driving timeline and work plans. We're going to really try to ask the big questions tonight. So in a minute, I'll talk about kind of the process, the inputs that I've had so far, what will inform my ultimate report to all of you. And then we will review some of the survey findings, not because they reflect anything finalized necessarily. Again, a lot of those were collected quite some time ago, but to give us a starting point to respond to. Because this is a PDF and it's on screen and we're zooming, didn't want to try to edit this live on Zoom. So I apologize for the makeshift whiteboarding, but that will give us an opportunity to add new things, to move things around. If there's stuff we want to pull out, we'll pull it out. So that'll be a little bit of a living kind of framework up there. And then I'll take lots of notes as well. Obviously, I'll access the recording to try to just reflect our conversation. And we're going to spend, as you can see on the agenda, we're just going to spend a lot of time organizing those strategic priorities, thinking about what's not on the list or what is on the list that maybe right now in today's kind of forward-looking moment, we don't think should be a priority. And then we'll do some work at the end to set a timeline and talk a little bit about next steps. So again, we'll try to keep that kind of a higher level strategic lens today, and it will drive a lot of future conversations as well. Any questions about that approach before?
Let's see, when are we hearing? Because staff have gone through an extensive
Yes.
process with you as well. Is that part of the survey findings? Or like hearing what or are we working agnostically of them until and you'll mesh?
Yes, so thank you for asking that. So I considered this to be agnostic is a good word for it. This is your workspace. And so I really wanted to make sure this conversation was set aside for all of you to visit as a council. And we'll start with some roles and definitions, not because you need them, but because it's a good kind of just table setting for all of us to talk a little bit. You will see kind of the themes from the staff working session and survey as well. They did inform actually the survey that went out because there were some new ideas that came out of that process that then got added into that survey. But in terms of, I think I wanted to make sure that you had this time just as a body to really reflect on your leadership roles and what you think, both personally and as a body, are priorities moving forward. So it's everything to date, the kind of contents of the survey, all of that was informed by staff work to date. In the final presentation, we will kind of bring everything together. But you are, I keep forgetting, sorry. you guys are our strategic leaders for the city of Lander. And I wanted to make sure that we set aside space to talk about that. I'm gonna figure this out one way or another. Turns out I didn't need to put this.
Can I have one thing? So
Mhm.
also remember that, the community input on the master plan, we'll be getting that at next week's work sessions. So when we had initially contracted with heirs, the idea was it would have been done by now, but as often happens, they needed more time, so that's another part of what we'll have to help inform us, but we do have the survey summary is one of our documents, but we'll get a whole bunch of more info
That's
from their
great.
presentation.
And thank you for mentioning that, because I want to make sure, this is back to the inputs for a component, that I'm pulling in all of the inputs that you would like reflected and how I report that out. So if it would be useful to you for me to have that full reporting from the survey coming next week, I can certainly fold that into how I frame the final report. It turns out I didn't need to make a slide that said this, because it's on the wall, which I love, because I am a mission first person. And it's always, whenever I do anything like this, I always want to start with mission, because at the end of the day, when we're thinking about what we prioritize and how we do the good work, how you all do the good work to kind of move things forward for the city of Lander, it ultimately is going to come back to mission and the city's vision. And if you look at certainly the language in the mission, it's not surprising to me that both on the staff side and on the council side, when survey responses come back, you see a lot of those words reflected in how people talk about their duties to the city of Lander, how they think about priorities, quality of life, community, safety, certainly being a big one, obviously, stability, a responsive government, a responsive environment. So I always like to start there, because if we're ever getting down in the weeds or getting too tactical too soon, zooming back up and thinking about how does this connect back to the mission and what we're trying to do. And really, ultimately, when we think about a strategic plan, you know, there's the kind of day-to-day work, or even the annual work plans that get put together, or the project work plans that get put together to kind of get things done. Then you have your high-level mission. A good strategic plan, a good strategic framework is that layer in between. It's the connective tissue between your mission and then what you're doing on a day-to-day basis to keep things moving forward. I have time, sorry. guys. I also wanted to start here, not because obviously all of you know this quite well, but just to kind of again level set around the important leadership, visionary role that each of you plays in different capacities, as our mayor, as members of council. And just thinking about what the kind of value, what the role that you play is in strategic planning. And I'll give you a heads up that in a minute, I do want to go around and actually ask everybody what it is that draws you to service in your role for the city of Lander when you think about what's important to you. So I'm going to give you that heads up now so you have time to think while we're just running through this. But essentially, you know what your roles are, but this is a good reminder about the really important strategic components of the work that you all do as council and as mayor. So decisions about, you know, for the mayor, what policies to recommend, how to kind of oversee, you know, work at the staff level. Certainly that language that I think that one was from WHAM, but the people's representative, really advancing the vision. That's a critical strategic lens as the chief executive of a city. And then for the council, the role in establishing policy, a budget, you know, the budget document is a reflection of a city's values too, of an organization's values. So all of these things require, you know, a really strong strategic lens. And we'll be asking you to think about kind of what you and your role can do to advance the vision and the work of the city today. So having given you a minute to think about it, just really quickly, partly because I'm getting to know a number of you, I'd really like to go around and say just briefly in your role as mayor or as councilor, what is it that drew you to service? What's most important to you as a value in your service to Lander?
Okay, you know, I think that when I started on the council, I think it's 6 years ago there now, that it was to the point where I was more or less retired from my business. I had the time to put into service in the community, and I just felt that it was really important that you pay back, you know, what you received from the community. And, you know, I raised my family here and made a living here, not necessarily right here in town, but, you know, this was home. And, so, I just felt that I had a real commitment to the community and that I needed to be a part of it.
So for me, really the driving force in all of this service that I participate in is the people. I'm a big people person, value everybody, really. I like to hear different sides and be able to chew on different perspectives and try to draw the best conclusion out of all of those. And it's just something that, it's funny that we say we can't find volunteers, it's just something that we do, you know, and as I get older, I realize that I need to get rid of some of all the things that I do. So I'm getting there. I'm getting there. I've got other priorities, but the people are definitely my priority of this community.
I think similar to what you're saying, John, I mean, for me, servant leadership has really been a governing value for most of my life. And then my exposure to council came through, serving both on LEDA and also for the Fremont Air Service team, and as we needed to have funding from our, different entities. And so listening in on city council sessions, and wow, this could be a really neat way, again, to serve a community that has been so incredibly wonderful to live in, to you know, look at another way to be able to provide service to friends and neighbors and folks that I've never met. Hopefully someday I do get to put that idea of, another iteration of being able to provide, service back to the community that, you know, I fell in love with back in the dark ages, it seems like.
Must be hungry. I did this for one reason and one reason only, and that's to represent the people that come to me. You know, I was born and raised here. I've watched the changes, some good, some bad. But my main reason of doing this is to be the voice of the people.
You know, you're the only council member that's been born and raised in Lander. It's cool.
Yeah,
I was thinking about that the other day, and I was like,
it's just the way it happened, I guess.
Yeah.
awesome.
I mean. Think about this lately, actually, in the last couple of weeks too, myself. I just find it really energizing to do the problem solving at that intersection of policy and people. I do a lot of policy work in my day job. And I am drawn often to spending more time sometimes here because of the people element to that. So are we right sizing the policy we write the ordinances, the things? Are we listening to folks and bringing their engagement in to that policy? I mean, I hope the answer is yes, we are, right? So I won't say are we, but how do we do that? How do we make sure we share information about either what we are, what we're doing, or where we're going, and bring engagement in? So yes, I do love policy work, but I love that in this position, it's with the people element coming into it as well. And it just feels like I just come back to problem solving, right? How many little things do we get, or big things do we get? Calls, so this issue, I have this question, and I love figuring out, I know who to call. And then finding out that I can't solve it at all half the time, but I can at least try to help.
Thanks to all of you. And what I really love about listening to all of your answers is that each one of you came back to people and community immediately. I mean, that is a very tight through line through the way that each of you talk about your leadership and your service to this community. And, you know, in terms of a strategic plan, whatever is produced from the discussions in this process, using the lens, either at the end of the conversation today or certainly longer term, about coming back to the people. How do we talk to the people about how this work will move that mission forward? How are we going to protect quality of life? How are we going to do the things that the city of Lander says we're setting out to do how are we putting wheels on the mission, basically? And always coming back to that question, whether it's increased community engagement or new ways to wrap the community in. Each of you has a really distinctive focus on people. And I want to make sure that we always come back to that in the conversations today and in the future. So appreciate that. Sure, it's something. What's this?
In the night, right?
Oh gosh, bye. Okay. So I already mentioned kind of the strategic value, right, of really putting together a strong plan, and one that doesn't, again, have to be highly tactical or exactly at the level of a kind of annual work plan, be fleshed out to that level, but just what are the pillars? What are the kinds of work we're doing in order to advance the mission? Creating that connectivity between the mission, the vision, and the day-to-day work of the city. So I wanted to mention just some of the key inputs, and that comes back to some of the survey data we discussed as well. But certainly there'll be a public meeting that kind of is the conclusion of my engagement, reporting on the conversations and the work that's happened at the staff level, at the council and mayoral level as well. The surveys that were put out, some additional discovery work that was completed just so I could get my kind of head around some of the specifics of a number of the projects we'll talk about today. And so those are some of the key inputs. And like I said, these initial meetings are just the start of work for all of you, but hopefully we can get a good framework set. So our task for today is going to be thinking about one. We began with the initial strategic priorities that were developed in 2023, and so those were a good baseline to begin with. But already, are thinking about additions, refinements, etc. So we're going to want to think about new ideas. What new ideas can we put on the table today? Just put it all out there. That we should be thinking about for strategic planning. What carries over from the previous or ongoing strategic priorities, like what's really important to us now. We want to think a little bit about implementation and what that's going to look like. So what are the big headlines, the talking points, any kind of process steps that need to follow off of some of these decisions. And then certainly it's unavoidable that one of the conversations that need to happen around the strategic plan for the coming years is going to be budgetary considerations. And that can be a pretty useful crucible, or maybe a more favorable positive metaphor, but I'll say crucible for figuring some of these things out. Like what's really, when it comes down to brass tacks, and you got to think about what do we need? What do we want? What can we live without? It's a good framework sometimes for getting to the heart of these conversations. I'm so proud of myself. I just did that on the first try.
Way to go, Chris.
Thank you. I will take it. We'll get into the survey results, and I'll back up and give some background here in just a second. But I wanted to just flag some of the language that folks used in their survey responses when I asked about just any thoughts around desired outcome or output from just this initial process. And my goodness, were people united on clarity, clear goals, wanting to know what we're doing short, medium, long term. What is our path forward? I'm actually, I just realized you can. There we go. That way you can see what it's like. A good roadmap of goals and all the tasks and timelines to achieve them. So just starting to put together the building blocks of that roadmap today. A united path forward. There was a comment that really focused on wanting a process that was deliberative, which is what I'm going to try to deliver today. So rather than procedural or just let's move some stuff around and use terminology and just because we have it there, really wanting to take the time and space to think about what we're doing and why. And then certainly wanting to identify some areas where we're going to have to look to reduce expenses. That was something that came up as well. Another comment that I did not put on the slide, but came up in a different section of the survey, a desire to get granular where you need to. And certainly those headers are not granular, it's the opposite. But when we talk about memory care, we're going to be using the lens of how. What can we actually do to move that forward? Is it something the city should be moving forward within its powers? Is it important, but not something that requires strategic action from the city right now, et cetera? That's just one example. So we're going to try to think about, like, with that level of granularity, what can the city really do to exercise its powers, use its resources to, advance some key goals. If we're thinking about, funding more or funding less in certain areas, we'll want to come back to the why. What does it mean to make this decision? If we're going to talk about a problem, we're going to say, what do we need to do about it? So trying to stay really action focused. So with that, just some results from the mayor and council survey. So a little background on inputs. We had survey responses from 3 of 5 council members, and the mayor was able to talk to Councilor Dan Hahn over text a little bit and got some of his feedback, which was great. We were not able to get yours, but I'm going to pick on you a little bit more to make sure that I have good input from you.
That's fine.
This needs to be just reflective of everybody. So, so we will kind of start with this as just a baseline, and we'll kind of pause and converse as we go through. So I always like to start with strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, threats, the basic SWOT framework that I'm sure a number of you are familiar with. So in terms of strengths, frequently cited as the #1 strength, staff, committed staff, talented department heads, a lot of positive feelings about the day-to-day management of the city. A couple of comments that remarked on the city's fiscal responsibility. Also the fact that, taking community-centered approaches, making efforts to represent and engage with a range of opinions within the community. And also the fact that the city does take the time to do strategic planning and to do communications. So I want to pause there. Is any of that surprising to anyone at this table? And are there strengths that you either you disagree with, or you'd add something, or an additional kind of perspective you want reported?
I got a little bit on the committed staff.
Mhm.
I feel we do have a committed staff, and I think that they're trying the best that they possibly can to get things achieved.
Mhm.
But everybody seems to have a helper. And it's a high-priced helper that really, I mean, I'm not saying names or picking on anybody, but sometimes you ask them questions and you get a mediocre response. It feels like they're not putting in their time and effort to earn what they're getting, type of thing.
So if I'm hearing correct, just so I have my notes right, so you would agree with the first part of that the staff is committed overall, but then layer that with some additional concerns.
Right. Yeah, it's just money concerns in my eyes, but
Well, and maybe some communication concerns too.
possibly. I've always worked jobs where everybody doesn't have to have a helper, and I've kind of witnessed some stuff, just being here and watching and learning, and we got people that were hired on, supposed to be a part-time position, then it turns into a high-priced full-time position. You know, just everything I look at is budgetary. So when it comes to the public's tax dollars, I don't think that having more staff that do a halfway job, at a fair amount of money is as good as having somebody that's really good at doing their job and just doing their job for what they get paid. Right? Like, that's the way we work. I mean, I work for the state. That's how we work. And we don't get paid top dollar, trust me. It's good, but it's not,
Yeah.
but that's just a concern of mine, to be honest.
So just a question, can we engage in and just, I would just like to know, who and what,
I don't like naming names, man.
Well-
That's kind of like. Cause trust me, if I wanna talk to them, I'll talk to them in person, I don't talk about people.
Well, I just like
You
to
know.
know, what it is that we're talking about.
Well, I get,
Uh,
I know a lot of people that witness like what some people are doing. And seeing what's happening and everything, and they come to me about it, and there's nothing I can do about it, I'm just here. For budgetary stuff, and that's it, and be the voice of the people.
But if we're looking at budgetary stuff specifically, and we have positions that you feel like, we talked about it at the last meeting that are fluff.
Right.
I don't see it, and I'm not trying to talk you into it, but I would like to know too, just so that I can sort of see a better picture of where you're coming from, because I
There's a
think,
lot of people that call you know.
I think Hunter and Lance could be a good example.
Hunter is one, and he's doing striker scheduling, you know, instead of doing his job. If
Oh,
we're
at
gonna
work,
get
you
down,
mean?
yeah, if we're
Yeah.
gonna get down to it. And we've got some other issues, you know, that got brought to me that I don't even wanna talk about, man. I got a kid in high school and I don't want no problems with anybody, but
Well, can
I do
just-
know, like, people call the front desk at the police station numerous times, can't get an answer. So he had to get a helper,
Agreed.
right?
Well, I think
And,
part of that
you know.
comes back to this idea of oversight, this day-to-day management. So that being the priority, maybe that's not a strength. And that we could look at that as also something that needs to be addressed, because if somebody's not overseeing that. Or
Right.
if somebody's supposed to be overseeing and you're doing your scheduling. Who's responsible for that? And so maybe the point that you bring up is, it would be a good opportunity to know who's responsible to make sure. That if
Right.
it's Hunter or whoever, this helper, that
Yeah,
helper
yeah,
is actually doing what their job
well, my,
description.
It's a supervision,
Yeah.
Yeah.
supervisory training.
So it becomes more of a,
I'm not here to pick on people,
Efficiency.
you know, that's my thing, like,
well, we're responsible
don't
for
want
it, 'cause
that,
we
but
pay for it, so.
the money thing is what, yes.
Yeah. Yeah, okay.
Can I be a pushy facilitator for just a second?
All right,
So the next slide is actually gonna be weaknesses.
Okay.
And so I do think that's a good space to think about some of this. One of the things I also, wanted to mention, you'll see on one of the coming slides, that city kind of staffing succession, organizational structure as a strategic priority rated pretty highly. And getting into that bullet might be a good place to start thinking about some of these budgetary organizational considerations as well.
What do you mean rated highly, like as a strength?
As a priority to think about
Oh,
your
gotcha.
strategic plan.
Okay.
So I'm jumping ahead a little bit just to tell you that
Oh.
there's gonna be a really good space for drawing some of this out. I do wanna make sure if there's any additional strengths that you want to kind of mention up top, we can do those now, or else I can go to the weaknesses slide, because I think some of what you're talking about may be
Sure.
on there as well.
Well, and I would disagree with communication. That's a strength. I wouldn't echo that we have a strong communication. In some ways we do, in some ways we don't.
we could have. a strong
Yeah, it's a lot, there's a lot of moving parts, and so it's figuring out how to get the correct. information.
I mean,
It's not- Well, and I think Missy will do a much better job because she's a good communicator.
A little more vocal, yes.
Yeah, I mean, communication's pretty broad. I look at that and think,
Yeah.
is it internal, is it external? I would still keep it on the strength slide, but like, we're grading on a curve here, right? We're not saying a strength means we're A+ all the time, and we make mistakes. I think that there's been plenty of growth in communication with the public. I mean, frankly, I'm so thrilled a couple years ago, we all budgeted to hire community development coordinator, right? Who's communicating way more to the community than we were. So I probably was one of the ones who put as a strength there, because I'm like thinking, gosh, we're doing a heck of a lot better. Yeah, do we like miss some opportunities? Is there some like internal communication? Absolutely. So I think I don't look at a strength and think we don't need to work on that still. I think though, of all the ways to evaluate us, that's something we often do well. We do well enough to say. Yeah.
And agreed that we've made a lot of strides there, and there's certainly room for improvement.
Yeah.
You know, and it's also a two-way street, so some of the tools that the city wants to do are like sign up for text messages. So you can get that, but we need folks to sign up to be part of that. So some folks are, some folks aren't. And so, you know, we would need a veritable department if it were to be, you know, text message, right? That can be many at the same time versus, you know, the phone tree style, or, you know, there's so many ways that folks want to get their information. And I think we have to be strategic about how we do that, because we can't have a whole department of.
And is this
folks
like
doing
community communication specifically?
that.
that you're
Yeah,
talking about?
yeah, good question
Yeah.
for that, you know, or, you know, one of the things I think about is, can we use our Facebook page better? Can we use our web page better? You know, I certainly think there's room for improvement on those things. And want to acknowledge that we have made good strides in that in recent few years.
I think that's reflected in what came out of the survey, because it's on both the strength side, likely recognizing some of the changes that you're talking about.
Yeah.
But this came up a number of times, so
Yeah.
maintaining community communications, you know, sometimes a lack of clarity, You know, roadblocks with the flow of information, the flow of accurate information. That came up, that was kind of a through line in a number of survey responses. So I think that gets to exactly the dynamic that all of you are kind of naming. Some of the additional weaknesses, and some of these are kind of external forces and some of them are internal to city dynamics, but certainly the facing an uncertain financial future. And again, probably a good reminder that most of these responses were completed about a month ago. So some things have solidified since then, obviously. But budget cuts, what that will do for essential services. Also coming down to the bottom, economic development as a priority, but not necessarily a shared language or framework about what that is or what the city should do to support it. The current structure of the government came up. Also just general infrastructure challenges, and not to kind of like spoil the big headlines, but for every single person I talked to, including Councilor Dan Hahn, infrastructure ranks really, really highly. And that is true with the staff. I will just tell you too, you'll see it bold in a lot of places. I don't think that's gonna shock anyone at this table, but similar to your shared kind of language, I thought it's good to note that that is forefront for everybody.
Kristen, one edit, if I could be so bold, on that top one, I think it's less about impact on essential services, because we are statutorily obligated to provide those. But the impact on the secondary and even tertiary services that folks enjoy and benefit from and continue to want. And that could face decreased volume as budget decreases. Or, you know, things like Josh, you mentioned earlier about, you know, a few years ago, you wish the fire had gone to a district. Like, that might be a way to help address some of those things. You know, with property taxes being cut, and that's a big part of your budget. So there's also opportunity in that to think about some different ways for that. And along with the infrastructure challenges, I mean, like you said, we all know, man, there are some issues there. And I think also one of the challenges along with that, or weaknesses, is the cost that it takes to address that. And then, you know, our public, you know, and I get it, not understanding just how staggering the price tag is compared to where they think money comes from. You know, and so I think that's one of the challenges for that.
And the challenge of, we've been saying, you know, the deferred maintenance, we've been talking about that since I've been on council, which was in 20, I don't even know, 12, not that, but it's been an ongoing, you know, conversation of, well, we can't afford it, now we really can't.
Yeah.
And then that sort of excuses sort of blowing people out, so it's like, well, no, actually,
Yeah.
you know, the cost of doing just Lincoln Street, like you said before, is this astronomical amount of money.
Yeah.
And we don't recoup that, you know, via the 1 cent sales tax.
Yeah. And I'd say that goes up the chain as well, you know, like, I'm sorry, I can't remember which legislative body, you know, committee was talking about this, like, gosh, we put 40 million into this, you know, bond, like, that is awesome. It's a big chunk of money, and that is a fraction of what Lander alone would need.
Yeah.
So, you know, there's 98 other municipalities that are looking for that money. So the 40 million doesn't actually go. And I know it's absurd to talk about this, like $40 million isn't that much money. Like, it's a huge amount of money, but not when you look at the projects that are needed. Yeah, that's a huge gap.
Well, I think that the kind of additional notes that you made on the infrastructure piece are really important, that it's the challenges, it's the projects and the price tags themselves, and also just the kind of community conversation around those projects and finding funding.
Can I add a little texture to one too? Sure. We talk a lot about uneconomic development, and I don't disagree. This was through the survey because it's factual, it's in the survey. But it's not just a lack of shared understanding, and we talk about that a lot, that the council, as we saw through a lot of our LIFT discussions, didn't have a shared definition of either the economic development broadly or the type ones we want to prioritize. So I agree that's there, but I actually look at that and think, honestly, one of the weaknesses we have right now is the city does not currently have a thought partner or an advisory group that is helping us with our economic development. We have an EDO that has had some challenges, right? And has had some evolution. on its capacity and participation and engagement. And so I have great hope that LEDA's gonna come back together stronger and provide that thought partnership or that advisory role or the actual partnership, but we don't have it right now, and it's a gap for us.
I haven't been on the council where I've seen that
Yeah.
direction from LEDA. They've had their own direction
Mhm.
in what they've accomplished, some really great things,
Right.
but not providing it to the council in a way that I think has been beneficial.
So as they regroup, I think I wanna be able to cheerlead them for some, like they had in the past, really successful independent projects. Maybe not entirely independent, like made, I hope within I wasn't like council then, but like made over the purview of council somewhat direction, but like also that there's a greater back and forth perhaps in the future in
Yeah.
that direction and advice to us too. But we're, say, we need a highly functioning E EDO.
So the texture is, I mean, it's that, yes, lack of shared agreement or definitions, but also lack of a vehicle. Lack of a community partner that will be
Yeah.
carrying this. So then the task for the conversation, when we get to that, is gonna be, not just economic development, kind of where does it fit in terms of priorities, but what is the
Who's
council?
doing
Yeah, who's doing it?
Yeah.
What's the city gonna do to advance it?
I mean, along with that, and I know, I'm sorry, I'll apologize, I'm gonna be a broken record about this, is. Because of the financial mismatch of services desired versus funding for it. The role of economic development and increasing the tax base is increasingly important. And. Oh, yeah, just leave it at that. Like, we need a more robust local economy to bring the dollars in. So that we can do more infrastructure work, so we can provide more of these services that folks want.
Once again, all of you are waking up every morning and thinking infrastructure. So when kind of following on these questions, when I kind of asked about successes and failures, I mean, across the board, infrastructure funding, that advanced key infrastructure projects, including multiple instances of just kind of recognizing the staff impact and getting that done.
Can I pause there?
Yes.
It's actually, I was struck there because I looked ahead on the deck, so I was like, when we have infrastructure and deferred maintenance as a weakness, I was like, why was that not on the strength that we have a $44 million financing package to
Yeah.
do? Not every single street you want to do, but like a huge amount of streets in the next 10 years. I'm glad it's on successes because put it there too, but like, I was like, what, that should be, it could be a strength and a weakness, right? We are gonna take
Yeah.
a major bite at that apple.
Yeah.
In coming years.
I mean, universally,
Yeah.
I think that everybody who kind of had an answer to this one
Yeah.
said that this was their number one success.
Good.
A little bit more of a diversity of answers in the kind of number one, failures or weak spots. So incomplete information flows, delays and roadblocks. I think we probably pretty well covered the
Yeah.
economic development. Planning and zoning came up on just that policy piece. Anything from either of these that feels like it's missing that would be important to inform the conversation?
Can we get a little granular? Is it not, I don't know who put this, but it's not planning and zoning as a failure, is it the lack to pass the zoning code changes that were
Yes,
proposed?
yes.
Okay. Planning and zoning, there's a lot of other,
Yes,
hopefully
agreed.
things that are not failing there.
Thank you for
Okay,
asking that.
okay,
Yes, it's
great.
really just that. I was trying to be brief on the slide deck, and yes, that's what it's referring to.
I feel that some of the delays or roadblocks would be dropping the ball on grants and not pushing forward and getting what we need done so we can get the project moving along.
I will say, Councilman Han, I think if you're talking about the YDOT grants, that's actually a great example of incomplete information coming both from YDOT. In that meeting
Sorry.
as well.
No. I'll disagree with you on that one. There's been some stuff. That grant should have been completed 2 years ago. Project should have been done. All it came down to was, having an engineer look at it, tell them what they need, getting the paperwork submitted, which was never submitted. And then it's game on. You hire somebody to do the project. That never happened. So we wasted 85,000, which was, I think, a grant. it was a different source of payment, 85,000 to do a study. And then another 85,000 to do the same study. And then don't submit the paperwork, turn it in and get the job completed. And you can't blame the people giving the grants, because they set it out in stone and the paperwork was signed and returned to them saying that they understand. And then it wasn't completed. So that's a failure on our part, and I'm willing to admit we failed on that. And I'm saying we because I'm a council member now, right?
Mhm.
So that means we should all fall into that category saying we. And that's where I'm saying, like, there's things that are getting overlooked and allowing to happen that are costing the people money. And it's also costing projects not to get done, correct?
I mean, I think, you're right, like, we're not here to go point by point on that, and we may not agree as well. I will say that I think on the 25th, we're gonna hear from staff. There's gonna be some more information shared then. I think there's been conversations with Whiteout after that work session where they presented where what they said then is not what they're saying now. So I think we'll get some more information about that, and that one work session is not the end of the story.
That, oh,
We have a lot of successfully completed grants.
but, and I just have to say, I think that, right, wrong, or indifferent, I really don't have a stance on it, other than, I do think there have been 3 council members that attend staff meetings more frequently and have more information oftentimes than the other 3 that don't attend. I don't have to say names, I'm one of them that doesn't attend.
No secret.
But I think that speaks to what we're talking about, this lack of shared understanding, right? Because then the information that maybe that I'm receiving is all outside of staff and not direct.
Mhm.
Which can be complicated because then there's not time to maybe address and understand. So then it even creates a little more of a maybe a rub, I don't know.
Mhm.
It's speaking for myself with this lack of this shared understanding of projects and what we're doing, because I feel like I'm always trying to catch up
Yeah.
to the information instead of instead of being,
Yeah.
fully prepared, I guess.
If I may, right, I think 'cause we've talked about this in so many different topics, but there is the information, the projects move faster than our council meetings. And
Yes.
so there's good reasons why we get information at a council meeting to inform a decision we're making then, but there's plenty of things happening in those 2 weeks beforehand.
Yeah.
At different levels, and I think that's part of the like, one's incumbent on us to make calls and ask questions, when is it incumbent to like find other vehicles to get that information that's moving quickly.
Yeah.
Right, if a call happens, with whiteout the next day, or a whiteout leadership the next day, like. It's hard, right, because I think we all want more information to be better informed, and so we get awkward phone calls of like, oh, I didn't know about that happening. And
Yeah.
there's also our role of like, before council meetings, for decisions, we get that information to make that decision. So I don't have the answer, and I know I was one of the ones who put that first tab up there too, it was something to that effect of like, we've all had phone calls of like, I didn't know we were doing that. Thanks for telling me. Okay. Let me dig in.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Sure.
I want to ask a question just, and the next slide will start getting to this kind of framework for how things rated, because there wasn't in the survey, an explicit question about where would you rank, kind of staff, council,
Mhm.
information flow, relationship, any of that. I think you can kind of pull that under the city organizational structure and succession if you want to, but I'm wondering now
Mhm.
if there'd be value in pulling that out as something to talk about in the strategic plan. And that's really comes down to what would you think the city could do
Mhm.
maybe differently?
Yeah.
To get ahead of that.
Yeah, actually, because I have an idea on that solution.
Yeah, I have that.
Internal
as well as mine.
communication, perhaps.
Yeah, internal
communication, yeah.
I mean, do we
Yeah.
feel good about maybe putting that up as a
Yeah,
priority?
totally.
That's one of my priorities is
Yeah.
figuring out how to resolve.
I think that's what that's pointing to.
What did I say? Informed, engaged council with linkages to the community, which means we're the source of the information.
Yeah.
With
Yeah.
the correct information, but how do we get that first, so that we
Right,
can
right.
give it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
can
And
send
we'll
it.
dive into like, how do we not burden staff,
better
but also how do we
conduits
calling
to our
too.
constituents?
High, medium, or low priority?
It's a
medium.
high. Well, and I wanna go back to just an example of what maybe you're talking about, I don't know, but I know I felt it for me, so like with YDOT.
Yeah.
What I heard them say is,
Yeah.
prior to application, 100% completion, we didn't have it. So before, and I don't wanna get in the weeds with this, but
Yes.
this is a communication issue, and that is. Prior to an application for a project, it was required to be 100% planned, completed.
Engineer.
Yes. And it wasn't. And so. For me, it's going back to. Cause then again, that communication of, well, then why did the state allow it? And then fund it, knowing that it wasn't complete. And so how are we able to engage with that kind of style of communication so that we're getting the correct answers to move forward with resolve? Instead of like. This kind of thing.
And one of the challenges, and sorry for getting too into the weeds for you, Kristen. How do we then also effectively get that information from staff without violating public meeting laws? Or
Yeah.
having them to have
Yeah.
6 different meetings?
Right.
You know, and then their job has now become having meetings instead of actually doing their job, and that's not the efficiency and the best use of taxpayer dollars that we want as well.
I'll say spoiler alert, Mayor, I think
Yeah.
you will play an integral role in the solution here.
Yeah.
Yes, yeah.
And they've all be on speed dial.
And, anything else we wanna add to this kind of conversation before we go to the real star of the show, which is your rankings?
How are we on your timeline? Are we,
We're actually,
Slowing
we're
down.
great, we're
Okay.
perfectly on
are
time.
we doing all right?
I will butt in if I need to, but you guys are doing good. Oops, sorry. Forwards, okay, an interesting kind of diversity in how people thought about these priorities. As I mentioned, so for the next, most of this meeting, we're gonna be messing with this list and thinking about what comes highest, medium, low in terms of levels of importance, shifting things around. Since I won't be typing here, I'll jump up when I need to just move stuff around the board so we have it preserved. But for at least the third or fourth time, infrastructure, again, number one on every, and that is true, I've never seen unanimity on like a staff survey. I mean, everybody on board, including that text message exchange I mentioned, the infrastructure is number one. So I think that should make everybody feel really good that you are united there. Anything with an asterisk, actually, let me give you a little bit of context. So, anything with the star next to it means 2 or more of you rated that as a highest priority item. So you'll see that's mostly in that kind of greater than, and this is my survey weighting, 4, but there was one medium priority that had a couple of votes to make it a high priority as well. So infrastructure, and these are roughly in order of how they shook out in terms of like weighted averages and rankings. Funding for air service, ambulance, and ground transportation. Staffing succession in general, city organizational structure concerns, wanting to make that a priority. Safe routes to schools, community economic development planning, attainable housing, and then law enforcement in your highest category. Almost everything else then fell into medium, and again, that's roughly in kind of the order. I'm not gonna sit here and tell you it's statistically significant, it's not, but just for housekeeping, that is in order. So disaster prep, no surprise, it's at the top of the list. 2 people said highest priority. Code enforcement, memory care, maintenance, ADA, energy efficiency, all kind of batched in together. Fiber and infrastructure resilience was actually one of those new ones that kind of came out, and so was law enforcement funding actually, out of the staff conversation, but generally more resilient city facilities. And then new parks and rec, kind of at the bottom end of the medium category. I think that was sort of a middle, almost a perfect middle 3, if I remember correctly.
Can you explain to me what fiber and or resilience means?
Yes, that was about city facilities wanting fiber, and there's like a cyber security, I'm gonna forget the details.
It's a former priority, right?
Yeah.
You should,
Yeah, it's like
Yeah.
a cybersecurity, like creating fiber connectivity to
Yeah.
create secure information flows.
Yeah.
I believe was my understanding, which also has to do with general like cybersecurity and resilience, protecting data, protecting information.
it was from the
Right.
former strategic plan as well, so it's
Yeah.
brought forward as do we still care or enough to do it. I
Okay,
don't,
so when I'm talking resilience, I'm thinking something that's,
I think that word is, yeah.
huh?
Yeah, go ahead, sorry.
Yeah, so resilience is, just being alive and working, so what's that got to do with fiber and just explain that whole,
Resilient.
The resilience come from staff.
Yeah,
Attach
that came from staff. That was trying to come up with language to describe like
Yeah.
protecting city facilities, making sure they're resilient to like cybersecurity threats.
One
or
thing doesn't
other-
take down the whole,
Yeah.
okay,
it's not a term I would have applied to that either, but
Yeah,
okay,
But basically to withstand.
Yep.
an attack.
okay.
we can get rid of that. We can, do whatever.
Maybe we just need a better,
Yeah.
like, not better, we got detail from that perhaps.
Might be weird, but.
Greenhouse gas came last.
And that was a reduction.
County.
Yeah.
Like,
What
It's a
do
county
we-
contract right now.
which we've,
Right,
frankly, I
and do we
would
add
say
to
like,
that?
cause
Yeah.
check, we did it.
We
Yeah,
did.
we're done with that policy.
Right.
About
And if there's
2
any,
years ago.
we won't spend a ton of time here, but if there's any kind of follow-on work that needs to happen, that's what you could think about, but it seems like it was a very low priority across the board.
Sure.
everybody overall. And nobody ranked that as their number one, which is probably not a surprise, either. In a minute, we'll go to kind of new ideas, and we've already added one, which is great. But in terms of how this shook out, where things were rated, and again, a lot of variability in terms of how people put things in order, so this is just an average cut across everybody that gave survey responses. Is any of this surprising? Anything in these results that kind of jumps out at you as surprising? And or does it feel basically accurate to the current conversations you're having?
The law enforcement is one that I'm, I thought we're doing a very good job on law enforcement and, but is that a concern that we've got that's going downhill, or is it just saying, yes, way to go, that's where it should be, or?
For me, the inverse of, that they're doing a great job. Lander is an incredibly safe place to be, and that's a high priority to continue to maintain that. Yeah, yes, I wasn't noting it as a deficit, it was like,
Okay,
they are kicking butt, and
Yeah,
I am
okay.
incredibly grateful.
Yeah, same.
okay,
And I was like, I can't take a statutorily assigned essential service and not,
True.
as a high priority,
Yeah.
like,
yeah, right,
that way,
Yeah.
yeah. But it's not,
And-
that's the
yeah.
problems.
And that was added from the staff working session for that reason, that there
Yeah.
wasn't anything that in the prior priorities that reflected law enforcement, and there was a strong feeling that that needed to be in there for statutory reasons, and also because there is kind of a separate strategic set of priorities within law enforcement. And so wanting to think about that maybe as, again, one of these tangible steps, how do we make sure that's integrated into the city plan overall? So just trying to get law enforcement overall into the framework.
I mean, yes, this was accurate to me, conversations I'm having. Knowing that it's so hard to like prioritize things,
Mhm.
and individual responses will differ. There'll be people who want parks at the highest or, move economic development lower, like there'll be individual responses, but like generally I'm like, yeah, let's drive. So I'm not surprised to see that ordering.
Mhm. And I mean, this is interesting to note, going back to what's essential services on that entire lit. Well, I'm not sure about disaster preparedness. I don't know if it's necessarily statutorily. It's a critical idea, but law enforcement is the only thing that we are obligated to provide there.
Fire service too.
Yeah, but not, it's not on the list.
And the
but-
county actually is
Oddly enough,
obligated. not us.
That is kind of interesting that we don't have fire service on the list, because
weird,
we,
'cause, like, you aren't responsible as a city to have ambulance service, but police and fire suppression is
yeah,
So
which is kind of weird to me. I mean, I would think all
Right.
three should
yeah,
coincide.
yeah.
I actually believe the county is the statutory obligation for
the
fire,
it
and
is.
we've adopted it years and
Okay.
years ago,
Yeah.
but it's actually not not that we're gonna change what we do or deprioritize fire, but like this is a point of order. On that, that's come up to me recently. I do think, are we on the like add new things yet though?
Yeah, that's,
'Cause I-
yeah, that's.
I actually-
valuable.
I did write fire around the like. There were clearly there's some concerns there with our responses and if we have enough staff coming. So I think to me, though, it comes down to like, what's our funding options? Because right now, City of Lander has a decent number of services that we do general fund funding for when we have other funding options for, right? Cemetery is not a district, fire is not a district, weed and pest, weed and pest is kind of a district. So I think like in terms of revenue, I debated like, is it fire standalone or is it funding options that we need to dedicated funding streams outside of general fund that we need to pursue?
Yeah.
And that's really kind of the air service transportation conversation, honestly. And I would debate having ambulance be on our strategic plan for that, because I don't think that's the place for it, but That's two
Yeah.
conversations at once.
And it's interesting, Jack, picking up on what you're saying, it's. I mean, it seems weird that we have to have that listed, because it's such an assumption that, of
Mhm.
course, every community's got,
Right.
you know, it's like,
Mhm.
and I think for us, because the financial implication of a single ambulance service trying to provide service to a county as massive as it is. So when there's a call in DuBois, that has major impact on the other ambulances and having to shift where they're staged and that's part of the cost and, you know, all of that. So suddenly it comes back to being on there. And I would think about adding, our fire department in the medium. As I think about the likely changes that are gonna happen to property tax in the coming couple of years, like if that
Mhm.
continues to cut, then boy, that is gonna make a big impact
Yeah.
on our fire department and how it's funded, what structure needs to go, that type of stuff.
Yeah, so it's funding
it's-
and, yeah.
And then as you mentioned, you know, the number of folks who are aging out and the challenges of being able to be accessible when employers aren't as generous as they've previously been with allowing folks to leave the job site to go answer a call.
Mhm.
Folks who live in town but work someplace else, so they have limited availability. Oh, you know, all those things are real challenges.
Mhm.
That are a hard nut to crack.
So typically, does, does your employer, YDOT, do they say, okay, Josh, you can go out on 2 calls this month or 4 calls? Or
We get 24, they just moved it to 24 hours a year.
That's not very much. is it?
No, you get, like, we've been, you go on a good structure, it'll pop off at 2 in the morning or something, you're there all day.
Yeah.
So
12
you
hours
burn up,
easy.
you burn up your time there, and then you're using vacation basically to go on calls.
Well, they usually
And
only
that's
have it
if
on
you
weekends
can.
anyway.
Sometimes, it
Okay.
depends.
They're scheduled.
Most of the time, it's an inconvenient time that happens.
Still,
but-
yeah, right.
No, yeah, a lot of us, if we can get out, it's all work related stuff, during the day, so it's workload if we can go.
Mhm.
Most of us, if we burn through our time, we just use our vacation time.
So how about other firefighters, what, do you have any idea of what they're,
No, they probably take a hit, I don't know.
Yeah.
It's
Yeah,
interesting that you say that because years ago, when pagers were still being carried, it was a non-issue. You
Yeah.
were at work and you got paged out for a fire and
you just
the
left?
employer said, off you go, and you don't need,
Yeah,
you're
it-
technically still at work, and
it's
it's
changed,
changed a little bit.
yeah, it makes it tough, I mean, it's,
Okay,
How many volunteers come to the meetings, would you say?
how many volunteers come to our meetings,
Fire
like the
department
fire
meetings,
meetings? Gosh, we're usually -2 on, cause they're traveling or working and stuff,
Yeah.
usually we're everybody on the
Everybody
roster
on
is
the roster.
shown, yeah.
Nice.
And that's
So we have high
training,
attendance, but not, lower call outs, lower attendance on call outs.
we're getting better, it's picking up, we've been picking up, we're rolling 2 engines on calls more and more.
I wonder if
Um,
there's a compensation change for us on that. We pay per meeting, not per response, right?
Yeah,
If
it's
people
all,
are having to leave work to take vacation, maybe we can compensate that. Again,
I
this
think-
says maybe too granular, sorry,
No, it's
but we should figure out fire.
It's a good solution, yeah, I mean, right?
and really, the trainings, we do. Trying to remember now, cause I get council and that backwards, cause we've been doing special meetings,
Great.
first and third months of the year, so we have a business meeting first and then a training on the third. So like this Thursday is gonna be a training.
Mhm.
So we do 2 trainings a month, and then the trainings, that's, we put in a lot of hours on that, but.
So maybe what we're directing is like a research, funding options for the city that can be different, but then also how do we change perhaps how we interact with, how the compensation we offer, the benefits we offer, how to make it more appealing for folks to go to calls
And
and get more people on the roster. too.
all the people that are there, they do it. Just like I do, just to help people.
Right.
I
Yeah,
don't
they're-
expect anything from anybody, I just do it to help people, that's.
Right.
um,
But we want to be able to like find the folks who want to help, but also then feel constrained by their jobs. Is there a way we can make it easier for them to make that choice, right? They're not choosing between a paycheck and a helping.
Yeah.
Maybe, so it's a research direction.
Well, and I'll say too, the staff conversation around transportation, I mean, it came back to funding, right? So when all of that really is about a funding bucket
Yeah.
for air ambulance and ground transportation. And
Yeah.
this, there could be a case for linking those things together if it's about finding funding streams, but I do like the idea of pulling this off as a separate
Mhm.
kind of topic.
Yeah.
And we've all seen, or most of us, we'll see, there's a survey going around from FCAG to assess the palatability and the like interest in all the municipalities in the county, doing some research into the funding options for ambulance, air, transportation, and economic development. So those are clumped in that venue, but I think it's worth saying at a city council strategic planning session that I'm not interested at all in us finding funding options for ambulance from the city budget. Like we're not being asked to do that. I don't see that that's a need. And so those conversations are happening and we'll participate in through other affiliations we have, but it's a county-wide and multi-municipality issue, not a city of Lander issue.
Transportation, that's kind of a broad, is that like WRTA
Yes,
and
Yeah. ground
airlines
transportation.
and
Yeah,
stuff like
senior
that?
buses.
And senior
Yeah.
buses, yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
Most senior buses are included in that?
Yeah, they're considered ground transportation.
Okay.
Like our senior center,
But we didn't,
pretty commonly does 60 transports a
I
day.
understand that, but did they receive?
They were
Yeah.
supposed to be eligible for funding from the half cent.
Did they get any?
They did some.
Through the ground.
What else is missing? So we've added a couple things, which is great, but I want to make sure that all ideas are on the table for us to work with. Well, what's new that could be beneficial to discuss?
Well, I mean, one thing that we've talked about here that's not on the list is continued improvement to our communication
Mhm.
internally and to the public.
There was an idea, and this gets to a structural piece with the report, and it can be set up any way you want. It could be, yeah, both ways. There was an idea about maybe as part of the kind of strategic plan, basically having a comms, like a communications deliverable bullet point kind of associated with every priority, so that it's woven in throughout the entire plan, rather than pulled out as a plank, basically. But I could see a case for it either way.
Yeah, I think that depends on what kind of communication we're talking about. Like this winter when Anne started putting out here's where we're hoping, given these caveats, that these things happen. That was really well received from folks. And we know things can change and equipment breaks down, that type of stuff. And that was included in that, but boy, folks seem to really like that. So are there more of those things we can
Yeah.
do? And then also encourage some of our partners. So when Lincoln Street project starts, that's ultimately the company's responsibility to be doing that communication. But surely like, we can be echoing that as well. But I think
Did we just see something on that here the other day
Yeah.
where
Mhm.
High Country
Yeah.
was, I
Yeah.
thought that was great.
Yeah, what they're.
That was
what they're
awesome.
trying to
It was.
do. Yeah,
And then we have it so we can relay the information, but I do hope
Yeah.
that, businesses are happy already. So they're prepared.
yeah, and it sounds like so that's a great
looks-
example
yeah, that's a
of,
good example.
so we heard in a staff
Yeah.
meeting,
Mhm.
that there's. I can't remember the name of the company doing the work, but they've reached out to all the business owners. And there were just 4 that wanted additional information. So like, oh, that's great to know.
Yeah, that's good to know.
That seems like a pretty good, well, I guess most of the businesses are in a smaller sector, right? But that's great to know that
Yeah.
that's happening. And there's opportunity for more information and folks are taking advantage of that.
So if we come back, I mean, I think you could really pair this with the internal communications piece and just talk about like information flow overall. Just come up with a good strategic goal that covers both sides of it. And then you have kind of projects and tasks that tie to both goals, both improving
Mhm.
internal communications, mayor, council, staff, information flow that way, but also all of the external pieces.
Yeah, they are integrated, right? We'll have a lot of the internal communication, like, yeah, we can't answer questions from internal info because we get a call externally saying, what about this? But it's,
Yeah.
it is integrated. Yeah. Okay. Mhm.
The-
Mhm.
I'll go back to excuse me, one of my earlier concerns and a priority is increasing our tax base so that we can address our high priorities. Because most of those things there are net losses, they're not necessarily gains. So how do we get more vibrant economy so that we can better achieve these things?
Would you put that kind of within the economic development planning framework, or would you make that a separate? Because they really do go hand in hand, right?
Yeah, there's definitely, I see where you're going on that. I obviously thinking off the top of my head, I'd like them right now to be different.
Mhm.
For that bullet point out, again, in communication, it's not just about community economic development planning, but the idea like folks, we don't pencil is the bottom line. So if we want to keep all these things, and I think folks do, that's got to be a broad spread. It's not just council, it's not just LEDA, it's, all of Lander, we got to work together to make these things happen for that specific reason. So that's why I think I'd rather keep it separate
Mhm.
so that has a little higher visibility.
So you would bring it back to tax base, bring it back to just growth overall for, how would you summarize it?
Growing the tax base.
Yeah.
Via businesses, is that what you're?
Yeah, having, and like. If you were to ask me, so how do we do that? Like, oh boy, I'm not quite sure, but how do we make all these things work? in the shop?
Infrastructure, business recruitment,
Yeah.
housing.
I know the
Yeah,
Events.
but it's all-
businesses have a hard time because the rent's so high on the, like if you have something on Main or, in that vicinity, the
it's
rent is. Cause my wife, she's a business owner, her rent goes up, it's almost yearly, and it's like, man, like, how
Yeah.
much can you take before it's too much,
Yeah.
But I think those are great strategies, and I know those specific things,
Yeah.
Linda is working on figuring out how to resolve. Or at least. Push
Yeah.
the,
And it's definitely a nexus point, right? Like that's part of. How, when we get into, scary, so this is gonna be challenging, like parking requirements for businesses. Like, oh my gosh, we have so much parking space that could actually be business space, and that would help. So,
Like in the code, the zoning code
Yeah.
itself, the way how many
Yeah.
parking spots you have to have per business, is sometimes insane.
not to kick a hornet's nest
So it takes
or
up the space from
offend
the lot.
anybody, but. Why couldn't there be like a flat tax on nonprofit? Cause we have
there's
a
a ton.
ton of nonprofits in town. And they're,
Well,
buying,
large
they're
ones too.
buying, yeah, they are large ones and, they buy a lot of the properties and everything, and then nobody can put a business in there. But they're not being taxed, right? So
Well, I'm
we're
gonna
not
tell you,
gaining, we're not losing anything,
We are
really, but
gaining.
I should say we are gaining, but we're also losing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
We're
Well,
losing a tax revenue there. And I don't know if you
Yeah.
can even, I don't know how that works.
Well, I'll tell you in my layman's terms, I don't either, and I know there are people that do at this table know. But we are gaining because we have them living in the community.
Yes, correct.
Yeah.
And they're
Purchasing
buying
homes,
groceries and
buying
buying
clothes.
stuff,
Yeah,
yes.
exactly, and so I think that, yes, Knowles and a Catholic college are not
Right.
probably paying their fair share of. Taxes, property tax specifically, but other taxes they are.
And there's more than just those. I mean, there's a
Yeah.
ton.
Yeah.
Well,
A
and
lot.
the benefit to the community and what that draws, so I was a big proponent of that's horseshit and they need to pay
Yeah.
a couple of years ago, and then I was enlightened.
Oh,
And I was like, oh, okay, that makes complete sense, and that is this idea that. What they bring to the community far
it surpasses.
surpasses
Say
the,
a flat
the,
tax or something.
Tangent to that too, if you don't mind, is that, I'm trying to think who I was talking with, but, they were saying, our code enforcement.
Yeah.
Is that, we ding somebody for pushing snow out onto the street. And, they say, okay, what's the fine for pushing snow out into the street? Well, it's $100. Well, what's it gonna cost me to have, Artery or somebody else haul that away? Well, it's gonna be $500. Well, hell, I'm gonna continue
Yeah.
pushing it out in the street, you know, and I'll pay you $100 every time,
Mhm.
you know, and it's a lot cheaper than going
Yeah.
through the process there, you know, so I think that that's another thing that we need to look at, you know, is where our code enforcement's at. Are we in line
Mhm.
with what needs to be done there?
Do we wanna hear, like, do we wanna learn more about the licensing options?
Yeah, I was
Is that
gonna say,
interesting
do-
enough problems?
Well, do you wanna pair that, do you see that is related to code enforcement to where they're kind of, they go under the same kind of umbrella, or do you wanna pull licensing offices separate?
I think it's separate, cause the licensing, other than liquor, be new creation, not just enforcing what we already have. And it's also perhaps different departments.
Right.
Right. So I think there's, I don't think clump, I think.
This isn't final either, but general sense for high, medium, low, if we're gonna consider this.
I would do
And then-
medium,
Yeah.
yeah. I mean, liquor, I'd put high, and business, I'd put low, frankly, if we could split them.
Okay.
Our liquor licenses are outdated.
We can split those up too. Additional new priorities that anybody wants to kind of put on the table?
I'm gonna call Mara in if folks are comfortable with that, since everybody else can get the recording, so it's not like we're not being public.
Sure.
Okay.
I mean, she can talk about it, I'm just
No,
facilitating.
it's, yeah, totally. My phone won't get
Anything
handshake
else?
porn.
I am struggling, because I've gone back and looked at our strategic plan and our action plans from our previous strategic planning. And so what I'm struggling with is
Hey Mara, I'm just gonna put us on, oh, we can't be on mute, you should be on mute.
this idea, that we're spending a lot of time and resources to do this, which I value, because I think it's important. But then it gets lost along the way somewhere, and there's not follow through. And so, or it's not there's not follow through on all items, because I think we were able to really hammer out some good goals on our list here. But one of the things that I think about strategic planning is it's all really good to talk about what our high priorities, our medium priorities are, and our low priorities are, to get a gauge of direction.
Yep.
My concern is that it's never intentional, meaning we're gonna do this, we're gonna come up with a really good plan and a really good goal, and then 2 years from now, we may not even talk about it again, or we may lose sight of what we were talking about, and all of us are aging, and so our memories are fading. But there's some redundancy with what we've already, we've talked about. Several of these things were done previously, infrastructure, public safety, that sort of thing. So I think for me, a high priority would be that this maintain, whether that be by a agenda item every every city council, we do our updates, sometimes our updates are fine, but they're never really connected to what our goals
The
and
strategic plan.
our strategic plan is. And so one of my high priorities would be that when this process is complete, that it is that there's intention to it, and that we continue to discuss it.
That's an excellent point, sorry.
Yeah, I was gonna say that, that was a concern that we had at the last strategic planning, and it was brought up, during council and also staff meeting, is that, the city council had requested that we have a line item, what was it, once a month, or at a work meeting, or something like that,
Yeah.
that we just go over, each
Yeah.
one of these things, where are we at, what are we doing well, what are we sucking at, and we need to have that put in front of us on a regular basis. And like you say, we done it for about a year, and then it just kinda floats off into the, never land there, and we forget about it. So I think that's an important point, is that we keep looking at it.
So, we have what, 3 projects going this year? We got Lincoln
Three
Street, we
streets.
got up by the
Barlin.
hospital, and Barlin.
When it goes
Yeah.
In the hospital.
Yeah,
So like I look at that, that's a big step forward, cause
Mhm.
we're accomplishing something.
Yeah.
So like, when I think of strategic planning in my mind, I think of setting future goals. So that loan we took, correct, from the state, that's something where we do the project, we pay for it, and then get a reimbursement from that loan. Is that kinda how that works? If I'm understanding it correctly?
No, I'm not totally sure, so let me start with
Okay.
that. I believe it's a loan, and then there's a repayment process
Okay.
to start.
It's revolving, so as
Cause
we
my-
go,
Yeah.
as we pay back. we
My
get
thought
more
was, you know,
access, yeah.
if we go through the strategic planning, then we seem to like hit a roadblock, like we hit Fifth Street last year, we were gonna do all of Fifth Street, you know, and then all that, I don't know what happened, it just like bounced around and all of a sudden we're on Lincoln Street.
Mhm.
And it's like, I think we should, you know, I mean, as a whole, pick a project and foresee it happening and then make it happen, you know, and actually accomplishing our goals. And because it seems like we sat through this and we did all this and everything, and then it was like nothing really happened until this year, which I'm stoked. I think it's great. You
Yeah.
know, we got it looks good for
Yeah.
everybody, but it seems like we always talk, and then nothing. We don't.
Yeah.
Well,
And
and the reason some of that, is delayed is with the 1 cent,
Waiting
monies,
for
you know.
that to build.
Yeah,
and-
yeah, you gotta
Yes.
wait to, so
Yeah.
you've got a big enough pot there that you can actually do something
Right.
with.
Yeah, and then I think the freezing pipes on Lincoln is what.
That
switched-
definitely.
Yeah, that's part of what
Switched the
swaps
priority.
the
Okay.
priority level for it.
But-
And I know the little bit of skim coating on Fifth is not gonna,
Well, and there's some bad
Yeah.
sewer problems on South Fifth. Like,
Yeah.
I know some people living over there, and it's a whole little neighborhood, but
Right.
yeah, they've got some serious stuff going on, it seems
They're
like.
on Fremont Street too, yeah. It's all the
Yeah.
same thing, I think.
so those folks have septic tanks.
Yeah,
Mhm.
yeah,
Yeah,
that's right.
yeah, we're like, yeah, that's a whole nother.
That's a different.
Yeah, that's a whole different ball of wax.
Well, zooming back out for a second, thinking about outputs, because I think that's a great point. One of the things that I can do in my reporting, I mean, my goal overall, when I come out of this and report, here are some of the priorities discussed and how they're kind of organized, is to try to make it actionable in a way where like staff work plans can even roll up under these strategic headers, and that'll make it easier and more seamless to just get reporting on projects. And that's something that we can talk about kind of as an output. I can also include, one of the things I'm planning to do is just have general recommendations, because like, we have 40 minutes left today, not even. And as I mentioned in the beginning, I mean, we're just starting to scratch the surface, so you guys are gonna have to think about what's gonna work for you as a body to keep tapping into some of these conversations and making space for it. And so thinking about this as like step 2 maybe, in an ongoing process that will shape and ultimately refine your strategic plan, will also help. So I can think about like recommendations or ways to reflect that in the report, but I certainly hear that as a huge priority. It's not, worth the time and investment unless you can make it actionable.
Right.
Absolutely. I think also, just looking at the time too, let's bring it to, let's probably look up there actually. Because that's really where, and I apologize that there's a lot of just summary. These are all the kind of different priorities, new and old, that made it up here. So before we start moving things around or pulling things out, I want to start from the lens of what can really the city do to move things forward for any of these priorities. There may be kind of things up on this list that are really, really important, but you may kind of move them down the priority list because when we get into it, there isn't a whole lot that the city can move forward in the next 2 to 3 years. So that isn't, thinking about how any of this is going to be actionable by you as a body, by the mayor, by the staff, is a really important lens to kind of bring to start. And we'll bring budget in just a second too. But first question, kind of now having gone through some of these conversations, is there anything on this list that feels either misplaced in its category, looking at it now, or that you would just fully suggest pulling off the list?
I have one.
Yep.
So the idea of a greenhouse gas reductions goal that
Mhm.
came forward from the other strategic plan, we're done, we did that. We have that set in policy resolution. And so I don't think, I don't think it needs to be up there. We have under building maintenance, energy efficiency, which so they continue to work and
Same
implementing
thing,
is there.
yeah. Mhm.
But like, we don't need to talk about any reductions any longer.
Does everyone basically agree to pull that out?
I do.
What do you just said? Over here.
We should
Okay.
probably give the staff something that's low though. Like, we've a little-
Well, that's the question, right, is that if we start using that narrowing lens about, you know, what is most critical to take action on, right? Not necessarily just most critical because it's important for a city, but like what is most critical for us to act on? Does that change the way any of this is arranged?
Mhm.
So one thing that's coming to mind for me is memory care, and it's either gonna shift low or high,
Okay.
depending on whether or not we can find an owner operator for it. So, meaning if we do come up, so a few years ago, when folks were asked, there were some folks interested, like, oh, that's a neat idea, but
Mhm.
we just started this project in this other community, so thanks, no thanks. So now that it's three plus years later, you know, are they in a spot where they're like, yeah, so glad you asked, in which case, for me personally, I've shifted over to high because it's providing a service to the community, it's economic development, it's providing jobs, it increases the tax base, like, you know, it's a mechanism for us to achieve some of our other goals.
Mhm.
And, you know, if we call these various numbers of folks and they all say, thanks, no thanks, still like, okay, we're kind of done pushing that rock up the hill.
Mhm.
And, I mean, maybe it just goes not only low, but off the list.
Yeah.
I would be very sad if that happened, but, you know,
It's, yeah, low isn't off the list, so I agree. I think
Yeah.
we move it down in terms of actionable staff time
Mhm.
and resource, and like,
Yeah.
not because it doesn't matter for the community, it does, but because of like the obstacles ahead. So I would say low. So-
Yeah, I think there's some real obstacles there for
Yeah.
that, you know, you look at what Gillette's been dealing with, you know, with their, centers up there, you know, and the, what do you call them, the part-time nurses or the fly-in nurses
Oh,
or
traveling.
Yeah.
traveling
Mhm.
nurses, yes, that come in there and I think we're dealing somewhat with the same thing here at the Life Resource Center, you know, is that we can pay these traveling nurses to come in, but, why can't we pay people that's here in town to, you know, a sort of equitable type wage to fill those jobs, but, you know, the.
pay 3 times higher for a travel nurse
Yeah.
than just paying our
Right.
local staff better.
Yeah,
Yeah.
Well,
That's-
Does,
It's a memory down.
does everyone overall agree, just low priority for now, it's one that you could revisit at a later time, just because?
Yeah. And-
we
and
do have to
everyone-
make a decision though, right, because there's some funding
that has to be turned back.
that has to be turned back, so we
Yeah.
have to
Okay.
address
That-
it.
We did do that last
Yeah.
meeting for
Okay.
one, for
Yeah.
the business
You did?
ready
Okay.
grant.
Yeah,
The
I-
Wyoming business
I-
ready had to go. Yeah.
Yeah, and so we'll find out within
Okay,
a
okay,
few
as long as
weeks
that's
if,
been.
if
okay.
someone's interested in playing.
So my high priorities still remain infrastructure, enhanced and increased communication, budgetary transparency, and, city org staff, and then law enforcement as like super high priority. That, there's some interesting aspects within all of these things that sort of, interconnect, and, you know, that is your economic development, which increases your tax base, which then we talk about housing, and what that housing means. And I think one thing that I would like to make a high priority is to steer clear of any discussion about zoning.
It's
Because
other housing options, it's other housing solutions.
there's other solutions, and we do probably need to address some of those issues, but it's not been a well-received conversation, and so I think addressing the narrative around housing specifically and what our solution is to that. But those things I mentioned first are those high priorities, of things we have control over versus things we don't, that we rely on other partners to engage in, and I feel like that's a different
That's a
category.
great.
So would you revise that attainable housing? And again, this is all coming back to the lens of what's actionable. So attainable housing is a topic, it can be a priority, is, you know, folding discussions like, looking for other housing solutions outside of zoning.
Yeah.
You don't even have to say the word.
My preference only, I mean, there's a lot of housing options out there right now. what you can't do is afford it, so, but we don't drive that.
Right, we've got no
You have to
control
increase
over
your,
that.
yeah, we have zero control, except for density, but we,
Right.
it's like this ever changing weird.
And I think part of that also depends on the communication and education to the public about, you know, and maybe I'm off in my own little island about this. But let me step back a bit, because I bet we've all heard this from various constituents, like, I pay plenty in property taxes, my street should look great, you know, it should be fresh blacktop and it should be plowed all the time. And actually went through for all of our blocks, where all of us council folks live, using the Lincoln Street project, for the price per foot, to figure out how much. So if we could somehow put property tax into a dedicated fund to redo our block instead of going into the general fund, how long it would take, and it is astronomical. So John was the winner where he lived.
There's
and-
four of us here.
Yeah, but it was almost 250 years for that. So that's what I mean about,
Yeah, I live in a cul-de-sac, it's smaller than a block. You know?
yeah, and
You're
actually,
first.
yeah, and I mean, I did it for all of us,
Yeah.
and John's was the lowest of that. And so that's what I mean about, so if there are ways to, you know, I'm not talking like high rises and skyscraper kind of stuff, but, you know, I wonder if the community better understood that math, would that change and, you know, folks' perspective on, you know, having slightly higher density? So,
I don't
you know,
think it
it
would-
kind of got
I
put
don't-
into
yeah.
just this category instead of seeing
Yeah,
how it links to starter homes and young professionals
Mhm.
and the tax base and all of that type of stuff. You
Mhm.
know, it only got talked about in this really narrow lane. And I get it, like folks did not like hearing about that lane. And I think that's also our obligation as council members to put it into the broader perspective. So,
I don't
I don't know.
So I do like the idea of housing being up there because it has to be addressed, right? Because we need to house people that work here. But when you look at a living wage in our community, people don't make a living wage here. And so there's so many factors that are outside of our control to try to address. You know, there's lots that you can do, and there's things that we can already do, that we already have the ability to do within our zoning, our current zoning, that we can't really address because we can't drive how much. I mean, you have to make $25 an hour at a minimum to make a living wage in Lander, at a minimum, and that's for a single person. And I don't know of anybody in town that's your, you know, your grocery stores, they don't pay. And in our Lyft app, you know, we recommended $17 an
Yeah,
hour.
I think 17 or 18 was
Yeah.
the financial threshold for a
yep.
single person.
So, you know, these are all things that we don't have control over. So when I talk about planning or strategic planning or goal setting, or it's things that I have control over. So if I can set this goal and I can attain it on my own. And so when I say the city can set this goal and we can attain it on our own, and it doesn't require somebody else's. Now we have partnerships that are gonna be priorities, and that's why I'm saying that I feel like there's this other little mechanism of like high priorities within this subset, if you will.
So in terms of what the city can take action on this housing topic, just for a second, really what I'm hearing is like, you know, improved community conversations, maybe more overall community communications around taxation, just some of the property tax issues. I mean, is there anything else that you feel like the council should be taking action on, or could be taking action on? Because I think that's a perfect lens, is what's actionable.
I mean, this is the crazy brainstorm stage, so tell me all the ways this is not feasible, but like, do we incentivize a developer to come in by cutting a great deal? Like, it's things that maybe we don't want to go there, but we've focused on solving housing through zoning, and we haven't done that twice in the last 6-8 years. So maybe zoning's still on the table, some targeted changes, maybe it's smaller changes with better information, maybe, I'm not gonna say no. but let's put some time into the other crazy weird ideas of like, where do we have some degree of control in actually getting something built on the ground, not just changing conditions and hoping that it gets built. And maybe we find we can't afford it, right? Likely, we probably can't. There's a lot of, when I say incentivize a developer, I kind of cringe myself, but like, let's look at the options we haven't looked at, perhaps.
So what's the main goal? Is it to help the people who exist here already, or is it to bring other people in and just fill up the inside of the city?
It's to have enough housing to house your workforce.
Your workforce.
Cause we have,
Yeah.
which
I
we
mean,
don't
we have
currently
housing, it's just, you can't.
That's right, we
Yeah.
can't afford it.
The new apartments across from the school, I think they're $17.50 a month.
1,700.
That's more than a house payment, that's a lot of
It's
money.
more than my house.
Well, but we got locked into great rates.
Yeah.
If we
Yeah, you guys
bought,
probably
bought a
got
house
it
last
when
year,
it was good.
we're fine, yeah.
Yeah.
But yeah, so I mean,
Yeah.
you can build a ton of houses if,
Yeah.
you know, if that's what you wanna
Yeah.
do, but
Well, that's
I
been
think
my
it
tr- my
depends on-
trouble.
Yeah, this is where it's hard for me to just take a straight line on it, Josh. Because for me, that's a few things. So one is, supply and demand. So rental prices are gonna go down when we have more rentals available. Another part for me is, because we don't have increased housing stock, the sale prices go up.
there's
So-
constantly
Supply
going.
Yeah,
and demand
right,
again.
and like I worked, south of Sun Valley this spring, so another kind of mountain adjacent town, Haley. And looking at what their home prices are relative to land, are like, oh, yeah, these folks can sell their house that's similar to my house for 800, 900,000. So then they can come to a lander and say, wow, I could buy a similar house,
For
I
500.
or even
Yeah,
400
yeah.
and still end up with a bunch of cash, but they're driving up the prices. Okay, free market, folks are allowed to do that, but then that increases property taxes for everybody. And our residents who are on low income, fixed income are feeling that pinch point. So that's another point for me of why I wanna see changes in the overall housing stock for that. And then again, the idea of, I love that, Mr. Alexander wants to develop the land north of town, but again, like he's gotta put in a whole lot of expensive infrastructure for like 40 some houses. And then that's really expensive. So one, fewer homes, share the price of that. So it increases the house price, but then this is really expensive infrastructure that gets turned over to the city. And then in 40 or 50 years, we have to replace it, and there's no way we can replace it. So it doesn't mean like it's all these threads tied together in there is my lens on how and why housing needs to change in Lander. So it just, again, like, it creates, yes, we need more houses, and that particular style of construction is just putting Lander further into the hole.
The
Like the short-
triplexes, you mean?
No,
No,
single
Wade
family,
Alexander's
large lots.
property that he wants to develop and how he's platted it out. And there's some awesome benefits to it, like the pathway along the river, that is awesome, I love that, love that he wants to develop. But again, it's not done in a way that's necessarily sustainable for the city and gonna be done at a lower cost. So, it very complex issue.
How does sorry, quickly, how do you change that or make that more amenable for our benefit for a developer like Alexander? He has the property, he wants to put in water, sewer,
Yeah.
roads. So how does making more density make that more attainable, if you will?
Yeah, great question. So I can't remember
For
if
that
it's,
particular.
yeah,
area.
42 or 48 lots. So don't take this God's own word about that. If they were done in smaller lots, so it could be, 100 homes and still be on,
Same
5,000
infrastructure.
square foot lots. You could have a combination of more traditional single-family home and the pocket neighborhood style. So say, I don't know what the cost is gonna be, but say if it's gonna be, $5 million of infrastructure divided over 50 homes, as opposed to the relatively comparable infrastructure for 100 homes. Okay, you've just cut the cost of the home down and maintaining the private person's developer profit margin for it. And then likewise, we have a broader tax base for things like when property tax is distributed, it's done per capita. So if we had more folks living within Lander, then we get more property tax distribution, then it helps goes towards general fund, that type of stuff. It's more folks who are paying into the water system, so when the water main of 100 feet has to be replaced, there's more users there instead of, a handful type of stuff.
So rather than just having attainable housing as kind of a header, it's a strategic priority to look at it. A more action-oriented kind of bullet in your strategic plan is basically explore creative, could you call that a public-private partnership or, like relationships? I'm trying to think of how to capture what you're describing.
Yeah, and some is, again, potentially happening at the state level for some of this. So one of the things they've been talking about is the tax increment funding. And I've been a voice saying, that's awesome for the developers, but also make sure that there's some kind of funding set up for the municipality that infrastructure is turned over to, because they're the ones who are gonna have to do repairs and maintenance and ultimately replacement for it. So that's more on the legislative level for that. But things like, do we have, some kind of, gosh, what's the right phrase for it? What's a public-private partnership for housing and housing development? That takes a significant amount of funding to do that.
So we have about 15 minutes left, and one of the things that I'll let you know right now is that when I present kind of some framework, like a framework and some recommendations on how to structure your plan, I will have that actionable piece kind of top of mind, but I don't have all the information, of course, you do. So what I will try to do is give you and city staff a framework that you can keep kind of revising through conversations like this, again, with that overall lens of like, what can we act on? The other lens that we haven't gotten to yet, but is budgetary, and this kind of pertains to some feedback I also gotten from Councilor Hahn about just thinking about wants versus needs, and a more, using the lens of a more constrained environment in general is something that came up in a number of responses because, there are legislative changes that I think were on everyone's mind at the time. So using the budget as a lens, and I don't know if that changes the way you would think about rating any of these now, kind of looking at them. If you're just thinking about allocating limited resources within the city, are there things that fall off that list based on kind of the current fiscal outlook?
Go ahead.
I wonder, and I want to hear, just double check on staff because we clearly don't have a full understanding of it, but the fiber connectivity of city buildings and resilience, unless they say that's a higher need than I'm understanding, I would put that lower on actionability and funding.
If it was framed more around cybersecurity, would that change it at all?
I
no?
still want to hear more.
Okay.
Clearly tonight's not the right night to ask this after what just happened.
I was gonna say,
But that was
obviously,
another- but that was a different issue. Let's separate the two. I want to hear more. I just don't understand it well enough to think even medium in terms of financial, for budgetary and actionable, staff time.
Yeah.
Since it's been on the strategic plan for years, you could say maybe that means we should do it now, or it means it was an idea 8 years ago and we keep bringing it forward, but we're fine.
I don't know, based on tonight's meeting.
It's not the same. It's not the same.
Moving over now. One thing that's not on there that I am thinking about though is, and I'd probably put in medium, is exploring other funding mechanisms like a cemetery district, a fire district, a weed and pest district.
That did come up.
Diversified funding streams, which was on the last strategic plan that we did do.
Like those are.
Totally. Yeah. I also think, just to jump in here while you're up there. So actually I'd put fiber down to low unless, is that any concern there? Okay. Unless we hear from staff, there's something we don't understand there. Disaster prep, and again, it's not disaster prep in terms of prioritization, it's staff time developing something. We are fairly well prepared for many types of disasters, right? We're planning and the actions in place right now for flooding, if that's what that means, and we'll make a decision, but in terms of like new action, new research, new policy proposals, new partnerships, I would question that's on medium, like I don't think there's a new disaster we haven't planned for at this stage. So again, not that we don't wanna be ready for disasters in the big picture, but in terms of staff
Actionable.
actionable items for the next year, I question that one being medium,
Other thoughts on that?
especially if it's flooding.
I think it's pretty critical.
Yeah. I think you have to have I think it's critical.
Yeah,
But
I
do we
think you
have the
to
things
it in
we
front of
need?
you. I think you have to have it in front of you, you know, whether, I think that you drop it off and you're gonna get caught with your pants down.
I certainly hope not. And that's my question is like, do we have the policies, procedures, plans, research in place now to face what could happen?
I don't think so.
Okay, then we should keep it if we don't think that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think it depends on what's meant by disaster for me.
Right.
So I think about some of, like the wildfire that blew through Stillwater,
Yeah.
Oklahoma,
Mhm.
or some of the, kind of public shootings that have happened. What is our plan to communicate and to the community what's going on and to ensure continued safety, those kinds of things, so.
You don't have to look
we don't
very
quite
far
know.
up the mountain to see all the dead,
Yeah,
dead timber up there. If that stuff lit up, you get your prevailing winds coming down, I think that they come right down through the river bottom here.
It could
Yeah.
get
It would
Yeah.
be ugly.
crazy real quick.
Yeah.
yeah.
Alright, yeah,
Is there,
strongly
any-
attached,
so
medium.
communication, I mean,
Yeah.
that could fold
Okay.
into kind of some of the communications topics that we've, kind of surfaced in earlier parts of this conversation. What other kind of disaster preparedness actions, would be associated with that, just so I can describe it well?
You're asking all the hard questions.
Sorry.
I mean, major grid outages,
Yeah,
if we lost electricity for any length of time, there'd be a lot of services in town there'd be a lot of people who would be vulnerable to that. So, I mean, if we're just, again, brainstorming, I don't think that's likely, I think there's other things in place we
Mhm.
maybe don't understand, but if we're doing the big picture, acts of God, flood, fire, then I would add
Winds, whatever.
electricity outages, yeah.
okay, I'm gonna write that down.
Or grid problems, maybe not electricity outages.
Well, like,
Lots of critical
the
services have
wind
backup,
one, I
but-
mean, most of the time the fire department takes care of that, like, we'll go sit on power lines and wait for a power company to show up. You really can't do anything.
Right, yeah.
But
Mhm.
trees, stuff like
Yeah.
that, I mean, it's,
Yeah.
when was that? Was that 96 when we had like 100 and something mile an hour winds come through here? Were you here?
I was.
Yeah, that got crazy.
It did. It did.
Okay.
So it does happen once in a while.
Did you have another comment? I just wanted to make sure, cause I thought you were gonna.
No, man.
Maybe what we need to specify there is what do we want what are we directing staff to do about disaster prep? Which disasters, and, because we do, I mean, there are plans in place for the county emergency planning services, there are task forces
Yeah.
set up, like, there's a lot there. What are we concerned that isn't there for staff to take on here? What are we asking?
It could be.
I think from.
Where do we know it? Where is it? Where is
Yeah.
the plan?
Maybe it's a briefing for
Yeah,
us.
I don't know what the county emergency plan is.
Mhm.
No. I
So-
think for me, it's a knowledge-based question at
Okay.
this point. Sure.
So there's a council, staff briefing, knowledge sharing, and maybe that's where we identify what the actual items are. Because perhaps we just, right now in this room, don't know enough.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
I wanna hit, just because we're running down on time, and I'll do, like I said, I'll do my best to kind of capture some summary recommendations and a framework based on this conversation, the staff conversation for you to work with. But we haven't really gone into these two yet, and they rated really highly for all of you and also for staff. So maybe we start with safe routes to school because I think it's a little cleaner cut if I understand it. But action, sort of action steps wise, what needs to happen?
That's one I feel like is in process, we just haven't
I
seen
do
the
too,
outcome,
yeah.
we haven't
Yeah.
seen the shovels yet, but we have
Yeah.
the funding, we're gonna see some projects where on Gannett Peak this year, some of the Smith Street, Baldwin Creek stuff is in the works for the 10-year plan, so I don't think there's anything new there, it's just, we've
And
been
like the
gathering all the pieces
disaster
and we haven't put the
plan.
shovels
Yeah.
down yet,
I think there's,
but we're making a lot of progress, so we will very soon.
Yeah, I think a corollary to that folks have talked about is better pedestrian support. From curb cuts to having sidewalks to that type of stuff, right? I see folks pushing strollers all around town or their kid on a strider bike kind of thing. And it's hard, like there's a lot of places without sidewalks. There's a lot of places that don't have the curb cuts, so parents are trying to navigate buggies up and down, that type of stuff. And that's a tricky one because going back to some of our original codes, sidewalks weren't required. And and they're expensive to put in if you don't have them, so.
We need to buy easements now on the land, so like,
Yeah.
for a lot of places. so.
Yeah, or the expectation for that, so that's one.
But those-
I, it'd be great to have more of that. Also, I saw some places where folks did either replace or put in sidewalks, but there was not a requirement to put in a curb cut on the corner ones, like, oh, man, they just put in this new thing and there's no curb cut there. Darn
You
it.
know, and that happened a couple of times there last year. And, excuse me, I had talked with Lance, and he says, the city will pay for the ramp up.
Yeah.
So as I was talking with the concrete contractors, I says, why did we not put a ramp here? He says, well, because that costs extra money. And I says, well, the city will pay for that.
So there's something.
And, oh, I didn't know that.
Yeah.
And so communication, there again.
Yeah, it is, yeah. And it also ties into, part of it is code. So someone doesn't have to talk to the city when they're putting a sidewalk
Yeah,
to learn
right,
that,
yeah,
they're doing it. And it's not necessarily a licensed contractor doing it.
Yeah.
So it's a
Yeah.
classic example of how there's best of intentions, but there's not a consolidation of that.
So let's also touch on, the city kind of organizational structure, staffing succession, kind of the internal staff, not dynamics, but just literally structural pieces. So having a staff where, there's a mayor, there are appointed department heads, and then also the succession considerations associated with having long-serving employees, that, then as they move out of their positions, you're dealing with potentially a loss of institutional knowledge if there's not a succession plan. So I don't know how you wanna tackle that, cause there's a few things kinda under that header, but I would really love to know and from a council perspective, what are the things that you think about taking action on related to this question of organizational structures of the city, succession, operations overall?
When I look at Shari leaving, she does the work of 3 or 4 people, literally. And so how do you, and this is to Josh's point there also, is that you have to replace one person with 2 minimum, and sometimes 3, and that was just the game plan for years and years and years, is just keep piling it on top of me, and I'll do it as long as I can, and you get by and you do it, and then all of a sudden, you get to the point where, okay, I'm 65 years old, I've played this game long enough, I'm ready to leave, and you're looking at trying to replace them, and like I say, it's a minimum of 2 or 3 people that you're having to replace them with. Just because people are not willing to take on that extra
Right.
responsibility anymore.
Or alternately, we need someone who's got significant experience to do that. So
Mhm.
not someone relatively new in the field, be
Right.
it engineering or HR or
Mhm.
finance and, all those types of things. And it's really tough for someone who's mid-career to be willing to take a job where their employment could terminate in 4 years
Right.
as well. And that's a challenge, right? That's a pretty rare person who's gonna pick up and move their family and hope their partner, if they have a partner, also
Yeah.
can find a job there or has remote work or something. And then say, well, I'll give it my best for 4 years and hope that
See what happens
then I
from there, yeah.
don't get my job terminated.
So
That's
the solution then to that would be to address our ordinances and
Perhaps.
terminating appointed positions rather than making it, or having it be a council vote? Is that, I mean, then that be a
Mayor
reasonable item?
appointment or
Yeah.
whatever, yeah.
I mean, if that plays into the succession planning of city government and organization, and you wanna keep qualified people around. While we've never, I don't think we've had that happen, it certainly can, and it has in other places,
Yeah,
and then you're in a real pinch.
Mhm.
Cause then you have people in positions that don't have any experience.
right, right,
And
that's,
are friends of, or whatever.
yeah.
Is it worth
Yeah.
being explicit in a strategic plan that a strategic consideration could be revisit, revise, it's called the charter ordinance, right?
Yeah,
To, you know, re-examine,
Mhm.
I can think about how to write it, but the appointed positions.
yeah,
We don't have a charter ordinance, so it'd be
Right,
creating a charter
creating a
ordinance,
charter
yeah.
if that's what we want to do.
That's right.
And then, you know, we've talked about going from a strong mayor to a city manager.
That's
You
another
know,
option.
That's,
Mhm.
something that we've had some conversation about, but, it hasn't,
Mhm.
you know, what would be the pluses and
Mhm.
the negatives to that.
Mhm. Yeah, we had a lengthy presentation, but we never really debated it for
Mhm.
Lander. We learned a lot and then didn't have that conversation. So those are two options that can address a whole host of perhaps structural pieces, but also the one we're naming around appointees.
I think with transparency and budget, that we have to be very mindful of not spending more money every year, and that we, operate within our means, especially as revenue could potentially decrease. And that we figure out and really understand our budget, so that we know what we have and how we wanna continue to move forward for the future, cause I think that's valuable. While maintaining, we've done a good job of saving money. We never had that before, and that's good. But even more mindful of, you know, long term, so if we were to be without $2 million, how could we survive?
Yeah.
Those types of things.
And we're actually, we are lower in total staff than, you know, even 10 years ago as well.
Oh, really?
Yeah,
We're leaner,
yeah.
we're very lean staff,
We're definitely,
cross-trained.
yeah,
So knowing that we're coming up on the hour, a couple of things. So one, on that particular note, I mean, I'll try to get the language right, because what I'm not trying to do obviously is get everybody to consensus on exactly how to address these things, but just focus on the things that are actionable
Mhm.
and try to create language that will help you figure out, okay, what are we gonna do? Those are the conversations that then you have in follow-up to think about the next few years of planning. I'm also going to bring it back to the community and the people, as all of you did when you started this exercise. And just the lens that I will use when I work on this report and also make recommendations is how can all of this be communicated outward, delivered better, articulated with the lens of this is for the people, this is for the community. Making that straight line connection between the mission and whatever the kind of, however the strategic priorities are framed for the benefit of the community. So there's a lot of work to do from here. Again, like we scratched the surface a little bit. We got into some of the really high priority items. I think we did get at least to some discussion on everything that ranked highly. It's not perfect, and so I will do my best to kind of create the framework that then you can keep workshopping through discussion, through finding consensus. What else can I provide to you to help you with that process?
Nothing's coming to mind.
Okay.
Yeah, look forward to it. You've done well, facilitation.
Yeah.
yeah,
2 hours
thanks for that. I mean,
yeah,
for me,
totally.
I'm really
Yeah.
curious for the AIRS presentation next week to see, what a broader community, you know, what they've stated as their wants and needs
Yeah.
for that as well.
That wants and needs question, I think, is an important one for sure.
Right.
Yeah.
It is.
For the next
Yeah.
several years.
Sorry, it's always like the thought that comes
Okay.
after. I mean, perhaps maybe you're gonna do this already, but because we were debating like what does the fiber
Mhm.
mean? Like, instead of just having these catchphrases in the framework, maybe a little narrative description.
Oh, that's, so
You
you
got
will
that?
get, you will
Okay,
get a
cool.
strategic, you will get an actual framework from me.
Cool.
So this was literally just to make it
Awesome.
so we could read it on Post-it notes.
Brilliant.
But part
Okay.
of what I'm trying to do in taking notes is that when I write this up, it will not say economic development planning will be, you know, a 3-year process to launch a strategic plan, whatever,
Yeah,
you know,
yeah.
something that tangible.
Verby, there'll be a verb there somewhere. Yeah, okay, great. Awesome, thank you.
Yeah.
Did from start, yeah, smile, John.
Yeah,
Nap time.
yeah.
This is Josh and I during every photo takes
Right.
and digging swim in.
I do think that, looking at some of the, I also like looking at surveys, but, as a kind of meaningful input into thinking about what came out of the staff, what came out of this conversation, that seems like a really important thing to fold in when just thinking about those recommendations. So, if it's appropriate for me to see that survey data when it comes back, I would like to look at it, just so I can better understand how to kind of put this together for all of you, so. Thanks to all of you.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.
2 hours
Thanks
session
for
with the
that. I
council. That's
apologize
awesome.
about that
Oh, it's
technical.
not
what
yours,
is-
so
what is
Michelle.
this?
Oh my gosh, I actually even forgot
Pick it
that
up,
it happened.
Do you know what this is?
Hi, thank you.
Anyone?
What's that?
What is this?
It's a recorder, I think.
Nefarious.
It is
Oh,
a
that was,
recorder.
oh, I was like,
I pulled
ah,
up 3
I thought that was
recorders,
a bug.
so I was hoping to.
To catch everything.
Yeah.
Appreciate the conversation
you-
here tonight,
Yeah,
guys.
it was
When you
good.
post that
It
on
was really good.
the site, can you just do the, well, even the audio needs to be edited on the Zoom, but even just don't do video, it's not like we were doing anything
I
here.
know.
Yeah, you can chop off the
I'm
end of the
B2B in
recording.
pajamas.
Yeah.
That's what I would do.